This is Professor Bittinger, and this is video 3 for Chapter 1. We're going to start with defining ecological footprint. The ecological footprint is the demand of a population or geographic area on the land and water needed to provide natural capital. Please remember that we defined natural capital earlier in a previous lecture. So I would like you to think of the ecological footprint as the demand from people on the environment for the resources that they need, as well as demand on the environment to be able to absorb and recycle the waste and pollution that we produce from using those resources. So it's a twofold demand scenario. As we consider ecological footprints going forth this semester, we are going to look at eco footprints per person, eco footprints per nation, and eco footprints around the globe. And basically it comes down to the growth of your ecological footprint results in degradation of natural capital, which is natural resources and ecosystem services, as well as results in the creation of pollution and waste. So what is biological capacity? It's actually the opposite of the ecological footprint. Eco footprint is the demand on the environment by humans. Biological capacity is the supply from the environment of natural resources and ecosystem services. In other words, natural capital. So as listed on the screen in front of you, biological capacity equals supply, and it's referring to the natural resources, both renewable and non-renewable, as well as the different ecosystem services provided in that specific geographic region. One that I want to bring to your attention in terms of ecosystem services is the ability for the environment to absorb and recycle waste and pollution that are produced by us consuming resources, as well as natural purification of air and water. So when we look at comparing the ecological footprint for a given region with the biological capacity, we can actually calculate whether or not an area is experiencing an ecological deficit or an ecological reserve. So what you do is you take the biological capacity for that particular region and you subtract the ecological footprint that's been documented for that region. And if the result is a negative value, it means the region is in an ecological deficit scenario. That is what occurs when the demand on the environment or the ecological footprint is greater than the supply from the environment or the biological capacity, i.e. the ability to replenish those resources and absorb waste and pollution. An ecological reserve is the opposite scenario. It occurs when you take the biological capacity, subtract the ecological footprint, and you end up with a positive value. So an ecological reserve occurs when the demand on the environment from humans is actually smaller than the supply from the environment or the biological capacity and the ability to replenish or absorb waste and pollution. If a geographic region is under an ecological deficit scenario, that means that the people living in that particular region are living unsustainably. If a region is known as being in an ecological reserve or surplus scenario, it basically means that the people living in that region are not demanding more from the environment than what the environment can actually sustain. We also talk about ecological footprints on a per capita basis, meaning per person. So the per capita ecological footprint is the average ecological footprint of an individual in a particular country or geographic region. This is a figure that depicts the distribution of countries that are in a surplus scenario. in relation to their demand on the environment versus biological capacity, and those countries that are in a deficit scenario in relation to demanding more from the environment than what the biological capacity of that particular country can supply. So looking at this graphic, those countries in green or yellow are considered to have an ecological reserve, which means the demand on the environment from the population within their boundaries is less than what the environment can actually sustain. So they're in a good situation. The countries that are in red or orange are just the opposite. They are demanding more from the environment than what the environment can actually sustain or provide in terms of natural resources or ecosystem services. So let's look at which countries fall into which category. Let's focus first on ecological reserve. We are going to look at countries that are in a surplus scenario. So we have Canada, which has a very large land geographic region. It may have a smaller population though, and much of this land area may not be fully occupied by people as a result of the biome and the type of climate that is present. Much of South America is in the green for ecological reserve, and this too could be correlated to population numbers as well as large land mass with biomes that have a success of supply of natural resources and ecosystem services. In particular, in Brazil, we have the rainforest, which provides a wealth of ecosystem services. Then let's shift over to Africa. I would say that most of Africa is actually in the surplus scenario. Interestingly enough, you may not suspect this, and it is probably because of the number of people in Africa that live very sustainably or off the land, let's say, and therefore they don't have as much demand on the environment as we may have here in the US in terms of our resource consumption, high consumption of goods and services. So you have several countries here that are in the green. I do want to point out Madagascar, an island off the coast of Africa, which is known for its tropical rainforest and its rich biodiversity. Australia is also in green, as well as New Zealand, and Russia, as well as Sweden, Finland, and then we have Afghanistan, which is located in the Middle East region. Okay, so those are the countries that are in an ecological surplus. Let's look at some of the countries that are in an ecological deficit. The United States falls into that category primarily because we are considered one of the most consumptive societies in terms of resource use and waste generation. Mexico is also in that category. We have some countries in northern Africa, including Algeria, Libya, and Egypt, as well as Ethiopia, which are in the red in terms of ecological deficit. In the Middle East, we have Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran as being in an ecological deficit. India and China, as well as Bangladesh, also fall into this category of being an ecological deficit country where they demand more from the environment than what the environment can actually provide or sustain. Japan, being an island nation, is in the same situation, as well as Taiwan and some of the Philippines. When we go to Europe area, we see that most of the countries in Europe are in the deficit scenario with the color shading of red and orange. Again, this is likely correlated to high consumption of resources and high generation of waste material, and these land masses are much smaller in size in comparison to some of these bigger countries that have more natural resources to supply the demand. You also likely have a higher density of population in these regions as well. So some of the countries in Europe that are considered to be in a deficit scenario are Spain and Portugal, France, we have Germany and Poland and the Ukraine, as well as United Kingdom and some other countries in there. I think Italy as well. Greece is included in that also. So we have various countries that are in the red for deficit based on demanding more from the environment than what they can provide. You will actually have a laboratory exercise that allows you to look at this in much more detail and do some comparisons between the population numbers within these countries as well as the geographic land area, and look further into details pertaining to the biomes or the climate in these regions, as well as the accessibility of resources to the people that live in these regions. So this is a topic area that you will definitely have more depth in regards to going into more detail on this. This graphic is depicting the human footprint or the human ecological footprint in the countries in a shaded pattern, from green representing the least impact of the human ecological footprint on the environment to red depicting the greatest impact of the human ecological footprint on the environment. So as you look at this graphic, notice that it does correlate to the previous diagram that we looked at. We're seeing a lot of green in Australia, indicating least ecological footprint, as well as here in Russia, as well as in northern Canada region. So that does seem to correlate with the previous graphic in regards to ecological reserve or surplus, meaning that the eco footprint in these regions is, smaller, not as much impact on the environment. Interestingly though, we had some areas in northern Africa on the previous diagram that were shaded red, indicating that these countries were in somewhat of a deficit. But yet we are seeing, when we look at the human ecological footprint, that they are not having that much impact on the environment. Other areas of this diagram correlates to some of our highest population zones. So it makes sense that here in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, Brazil, that we have red designations, and that's because we have a large number of people living in small area having greater impact on the environment. We're seeing a similar trend with red around large population areas around the Great Lakes and around major cities located throughout the United States, even here with Los Angeles being along the coast of California. And then when you look at the red zones in Europe, again, this is correlating to a high population density and small land region being able to supply the natural resources and ecosystem services needed to sustain the people that live in this region. Similarly, we see that in India as well, and notice we're seeing that in China. Now, the geography of the land area does come into play with regards to this figure. For example, it's interesting that here in India we have so much red designated in somewhat of a linear feature around Delhi. Well, that's because the Himalayan mountains are located just north of this red zone, and most people live at the base of the Himalayan mountains for a couple different reasons. One being that there's a good water source supply in this region, as well as good public transportation. So that correlates to why you have more people living here as a high density area and a greater impact on the environment in that region. And similarly here in China, most of the people in China live along the eastern coastline, and that's because in this region of China, the biome is more of a desert type region and therefore not easily habitated by people. So we have more people living along the eastern area of China. This is a figure depicting the percentage of area influenced by human activities in the United States. The human footprint value is depicted on the left side of the graphic, right here, ranging from 0 to 100. So how are our ecological footprints impacting the earth and the environment? Basically, anytime our ecological footprint exceeds the biological capacity of a given region, it creates environmental degradation. Examples of environmental degradation include habitat fragmentation, which then ripple effects into species population decline. If you take and convert habitat faster than it can be naturally replenished for those species to live in and survive. Another example of environmental degradation is treated wastewater entering our streams and rivers from multiple wastewater treatment plants can result in an accumulation of nutrients in the waterways, and where that waterway enters the ocean along the coastline, it can create what's known as a dead zone. The Gulf of Mexico is known as one of the largest dead zones in the world, where the area seasonally has lack of dissolved oxygen in the water due to heavy nutrient loading. So those are two examples of environmental degradation. So is there any good news with this? Actually, yes, there is. The United Nations conducted a Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and the United Nations concluded that we have the scientific, economic, and political solutions to these problems that we could actually implement within the next few decades. The challenge with this is collaborating with all the countries around the world to work together in that regard. So yes, we have the means by which to do it. It's going to take global collaboration, especially in relation to climate change, in order to take steps in the direction of sustainability. This slide is going into detail about how countries differ in resource use and their subsequent environmental impact. We're going to break it into two categories: industrialized countries, or more developed countries, and the second category being developing countries. If you look at the percentages, 83% of our world's population is in developing countries. This includes moderately developed countries such as China, India, and Brazil. They hit the medium income level but are still considered to be a developing country. Then we have the least developed countries: Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Haiti. These fall into the category of low income, least developed countries. So 83% of our world's population lives in developing countries. 17% of the world's population lives in industrialized countries or developed countries, and that includes the United States, Canada, and most of Europe. This is a data table depicting population size, population growth rate, resource use per person, use of harmful technology, use of beneficial technology, and overall impact for select countries that fit in the high, middle, and low income category. Your countries that are listed here in the middle income categories typically fall in the moderately developing countries, and these countries are the least developing countries, whereas up here we have what's considered to be a developed country. So looking at this data from a population perspective, China and India are the two most populated countries in the world. The United States is actually third in population size at 316 million. When you look at these countries, you realize that, wow, the US and China, China is 4 times the amount of people than what we have here in US. Both countries have high overall environmental impact. There's a difference though when you look at this. The United States has a very high resource use per person. China actually has a low resource use per person. This kind of correlates to our ecological footprints. US is a high eco footprint, China's a lower eco footprint when it comes to resource use per person. Then we look at the next column. United States has moderate use of harmful technology and high use of beneficial technology. This category is relating to different technologies that we've created in order to address pollution problems and to prevent pollution from happening via different types of treatment techniques that we employ at industry and commercial facilities. China, on the other hand, has a high amount of use of harmful technology and only a moderate amount of beneficial technology. In fact, China is the country that brings on like 1 coal-burning power plant per week in order to meet the energy demands of its population. And those coal-burning power plants are not utilizing the air quality control treatment systems like we have here in the US. So as a result, they have air quality problems occurring in China due to their reliance on coal-burning power plant facilities, far more so than the problems we have here in the US with coal-burning power plants, because we have high air quality treatment control systems in place. So even though both countries represent high overall environmental impact, there's a little bit of a difference in regards to where that impact is coming from. For China, it's because they have a high use of harmful technology. For the US, it's because we have a high resource use per person. This is you and I. We are contributing to that category. Now, if we look at India, India is a little bit different. Again, it's the second most populated country in the world. It has a high population growth rate of 1.5%, not as high as Nigeria or Congo, but still a high population growth rate. Overall, very low resource use per person. However, they do have a high use of harmful technology and a low use of beneficial technology to counterbalance that. And as a result, they hit this category of high overall environmental impact. So that's a simple comparison between moderately developing countries and a developed country, looking at the fact that these two countries have about 4 times the number of people that we have here in the United States. Now let's look at some of the lower income countries, those that are considered to be least developed. These countries have some of the highest population growth rates, and we'll get into population growth in a later section, but they are categorized as having a very low resource use per person. So from a per capita ecological footprint scenario, these have very low resource uses per person. However, they do have a high rating for use of harmful technology. They do not have access to beneficial technology, mainly because they're not industrialized and still considered a very least developed country, and their impact overall is considered to be moderate. Again, interesting enough, Nigeria has more people than the US, much smaller in a geographic footprint, and considered to have moderate impact to the environment as opposed to our high impact in the United States. So hopefully this data table has provided a better understanding of the differences in regards to environmental impact of. This slide depicts in a graphic format major changes that have occurred in the United States between 1900 and 2000. As I go over this graphic, I would like you to consider which of these two changes do you think have had the biggest impact on the U.S. ecological footprint. So let's look at the data. Back in 1900, the life expectancy was 47 years. Now it's 77 years. So people are living longer, healthier lives. How may that have impacted the U.S. ecological footprint? Let's look at the next category. Married women working outside the home. In the 1900s, maybe 8%. In the 2000s, about 81% of the married women were working outside the home. How could this have impacted the United States ecological footprint? One way is that you now have 2 incomes per home, which does result in more affluence and more consumption of resources, being able to buy more. It also impacts the fact that with having both people within the marriage working, you need 2 cars as opposed to 1 car, and that does have a ripple effect for transporting the family around when the parents are at work and kids need to get back and forth to school. When they turn to be 16 years old, it's typical that those kids end up with a car for their own use to get around as well, unless there's some form of good public transportation nearby. So just this factor of women working outside the home has increased our need for more automobiles, would be one example I could put out there. High school graduates, 15% in 1900 and 83% in the 2000s, which does mean that we have improved our education system. Homes with flush toilets were 10% back in the 1900s and 98% in the 2000s. Now, how could this impact our United States ecological footprint? Well, more homes having flush toilets requires more demand for water to be supplied to that home, and as a result, it could impact the water resources in the region. Let's look at the next category. Homes with electricity. Back in the 1900s, 2% of the homes had electricity. Now in the 2000s, 99%, almost 100% of the homes have electricity. How could this have impacted the U.S. ecological footprint? Well, demanding electricity in each of these homes requires that we are connected to the electric grid that fosters energy to our homes from some source of energy, most likely a coal-burning power plant, perhaps a nuclear power plant, or maybe a natural gas power facility. So much of our electrical supplies are coming from fossil fuels, and the utilization of fossil fuels results in air quality issues and does have a ripple effect into climate change. So this increase in utilizing electricity has resulted in increased eco-footprint for U.S. citizens. People living in the suburbs was about 10% back in the 1900s, and now it's about 52%. The hourly manufacturing job wage used to be $3 back in the 1900s, and now it's $15. So how could this impact our ecological footprint? Greater earnings perhaps increases greater ability to spend and purchase products and goods, and could correlate to a more highly consumptive society as opposed to where we were back in the 1900s. In addition, we've seen a crime rate increase as well from 1.2 to 5.8. So let's ask some questions. Take some time to ponder some of these items. How many televisions do you think there were in each home back in the 1950s? Well, the number of TVs increased from 0.4% in 1948 to 55% in 1954. So there was a short period of time where TVs became very popular, and it went from hardly anybody having a TV to more than 50% of the population had TVs, and this was back in 1954. By 1958, about 83% of the population had TVs in their homes. Okay, so that's interesting. No other household technology has spread so rapidly into so many homes other than the TV. So when we look at the telephone or indoor plumbing, those took a longer time frame to spread into everybody's homes as compared to this rate of TV usage, um, even over a 4-year period, increasing by 30 some percent. So that's interesting as far as TVs are concerned. How about how many cars were in each home in the 1950s? Perhaps maybe 1 to 2 cars per home. On average, we're finding now that there are 4 cars per home, depending upon the size of the family. Looking at computers. How many computers were in a home in the 1970s? Well, very few people had computers in their homes back then. The personal home computer really came out in the early 80s, and even then, if you had a computer, you were considered fortunate to have one. So by 1982, there was an estimated 620,000 home computers in American households, and the average price of a computer was $530. Now, if you know economics, as we hit the late 80s, early 90s, we started to have some large computer companies do manufacturing and distribution, and instead of computers costing $500, they ended up costing $5,000 because there was such a great demand, yet not as much supply for computers. So we've definitely seen some trends of price increases and price fluctuations related to computers. How many refrigerators per home in the 1950s? Typically 1, but now it's not untypical to find more than 1 refrigerator or freezer per home for food storage. And then as far as the average square footage of a home, the American house size has more than doubled since the 1950s. It used to be about 1,100 square feet was satisfactory for a home size back in the 1950s. Now it's 2,400 square feet is the typical average size of an American home. Bigger home means bigger, more resources that need to be used to construct that home, as well as more resources need to be used to provide water to the home and heating and cooling to the home as well. So these changes that have happened in the United States have contributed to our high ecological footprint that we have as a nation. This graphic is depicting the ecological footprint in millions of hectares for a few countries. The European Union represents the different countries within Europe, so we didn't isolate and depict those countries individually. We lumped them together in this graphic. However, I would like to call your attention to United States, China, and India. Please remember that China and India are the 2 most populated countries in the world, with the United States being 3rd in population. So looking at this graphic, on the left we have total ecological footprint per country, and on the right we have the per capita ecological footprint, meaning per person. Now remember, China and India have 4 times the number of people than the United States. So looking at this data, first of all, US has less population than China and India. However, we have the greatest ecological footprint. Okay. When it comes to looking at us on a per capita basis, the US needs about almost 10 hectares per person in order to supply the demand for resources from our United States citizens. When we look at China and India, despite the fact that they are the 2 most populated countries in the world, their eco footprints are less than that of the United States. In fact, India's total ecological footprint is not even a third of what the United States is. When we look at it on a per person basis or per capita, it appears that China would need 1.6 hectares per person to supply the demands on resources that their population is exhibiting, and India only needs 0.8 hectares per person. One of the interesting data points to look at is for Japan. Japan has a small population. It's an island country, and it has an eco footprint of 540 hectares, or 5%. However, interestingly enough, because of its population and its high resource use and demand on the environment, it's about 4.8 hectares per person. So this graphic is basically indicating that over time, from the 1960s, we've increased our resource consumption and demand on the environment, and around the year 1990, we actually hit the equal ratio of ecological footprint to biological capacity if you consider it from a global standpoint. Now, this doesn't mean we're in dire straits. What it does indicate, though, is the evidence that we've reached the biological capacity in some regions is showing up as environmental degradation. Polluted water, polluted air, biodiversity decline, and so on. A term that I would like you to know is affluence. Affluence is correlated to wealth within a country, and if you have countries that have wealth, they tend to have high levels of consumption and waste of resources. The result of this is some harmful environmental impacts such as more air pollution, water pollution, and land degradation. Now, there are some benefits to affluence. Usually those countries that have wealth also have access to better education, scientific research, and developing technological solutions that can improve or help solve the environmental problems that we're facing. So, the U.S. and other affluent countries have developed technologies to reduce pollution, to reduce environmental degradation and resource waste, as well as other ways to increase our beneficial environmental impact. So we're finding that some of the more countries that have affluence have the air is cleaner, the drinking water is purer, most rivers and waters are cleaner than what they were in the 1970s, and most of this is because they have better education and scientific research that then results in improvements to the environment, as well as being sensible about protecting critical habitats and improving biodiversity of species populations that have failed in the past. This graphic depicts the environmental impact model, also known as the IPAT model. This model was developed in the 1970s, and IPAT is spelled out I-P-A-T, and if you look at this diagram, it's basically saying that the impact of a population, I, will equal the population numbers, or P, times the affluence, or consumption per person, known as A, times the technological impact per unit of consumption, also known as T. So the impact, I, equals P times A times T, otherwise known as IPAT. Now this graphic breaks it into two lines. The top is demonstrating what it looks like for developing countries, and the bottom demonstrating what it looks like for developed countries. The size of the circles try to correlate to magnitude, so less people living in the developed countries versus more people living in the developing country. The consumption per person is greater in a developed country as opposed to in a developing country. The technological impact is considered to be greater in a developed country versus that of a developing country, and as a result, you have environmental impact. Now, one thing about this figure is it looks like the environmental impact is similar between these countries, whether they're developing or developed, and that's not the case based on the earlier data table that I showed you, where the United States is considered to have high impact on the environment, and countries like Nigeria or India are considered to have low to moderate impact on the environment, respectively. This does conclude this video. please click on the next video to proceed with the lesson.